Thanks for joining us for another episode of Fraud Talk. I'm Mandy Moody, the social media specialist at the ACFE. This month, I had the privilege of interviewing my friend Tim Hediger, who not only holds the title of CFE, but of Whistleblower. From his initial suspicions and termination to wearing a wire undercover, Tim candidly recounts his personal and professional path to justice. So you and I met a little more than 2 years ago on social media, and it might have been even more than 2 years ago. But what was going on in your professional life at that time?
I was finishing up my False Claims Act case against my former employer. I was also looking for work at the same time, and at that particular juncture in my life and my career, started up my own little business, trying to get additional work and resources to support my family at that time.
Kind of give me a recap of how you ended up in North Carolina and what happened at your previous employer, and I guess just kind of give me a timeline.
Sure. So we'll start with my responsibilities as the Director of Internal Audit at Pride Industries. Pride Industries is one of the nation's largest not-for-profit organizations that provides jobs for people with disabilities. During my tenure, our revenue line was at $160 million. We had 4,150 employees across the United States, generally in the state of California, and at various military installations throughout the United States, but most specifically at Fort Bliss, Texas. During one of my routine audits, one of the major regulations that not-for-profits throughout the United States have to abide by when they're obtaining money from the federal government and servicing people with disabilities through a no-bid contract process, that there were irreconcilable items within our reporting structure to the federal government. And it was at that point that management's tenor toward internal audit changed pretty dramatically. During our review of these type of works, which were pre-approved by management at the time, when the department was out actually performing these particular audits, audits were canceled while we were out in the field and required to come back into headquarters to basically stop the audit in that particular audit. And that became one of 5 items that the federal government took a look at in the False Claims Act case against my former employer. During that process, I was demoted. Resources were taken away from me. There was my co-plaintiff was terminated, and after about 6 months of working with the federal government with the False Claims Act case, I was actually fired.
Did they ever give a reason why they were doing these things, or did they just, like when they canceled the audits, was there ever a reason?
That's actually an interesting topic, because what was found out at that particular time is that there was a legitimate, using their words, there is another internal audit department that was giving separate internal audit reports, not only to management, but also to the board of directors. So one can call that a shadow internal audit department.
Was that even true?
It was true, and that was the ironic thing about it, because it was only at that particular juncture that I got access to those particular reports. And unfortunately, those particular reports weren't benchmarked to, for example, the Institute of Internal Auditors best practice standards, anything in regards to the American Institute of CPA best practices or standards, any type of benchmarking tool, COSO, whatever the case may be. So it was really interesting to see those particular reports and how diametrically opposed the results and the conclusions were to the actual data that was within the organization's database.
Wow.
Which just reinforced the hypothesis, results, and conclusions that the internal audit department actually came to.
You have these discrepancies, you see these inconsistencies, and then you start to see, it being taken out on you and your coworker. What is the first thing you do? You called whom?
Well, at that particular point, that was only the latest and greatest discrepancy that we had discovered. the internal audit department had discovered, in addition to internal whistleblowers and informants that have been raising issues for almost my entire tenure at the organization. So at the first glance of any type of procurement or regulatory issues, I actually brought that up to my department, and I brought that up to a variety of different management and executive level employees within the organization. And it was either not fully followed up with, or there is an act of not wanting to hear what was actually happening within the organization until that one time that I was talking about, where we were actually out in the field and we were brought back out of the field because of what we had found and what we were going to find in future inquiries.
You've talked to people at the company. When was the first time you realized I've got to go bigger?
There was one particular day, and it was right around the 4th of July, and I believe it was 2008, where I had to formalize my results and my conclusions, and I started delivering that to management within the product or within the line of business, and there was an active disdain on what my results and my conclusions were, just purely based upon the data, and they actively ran it up to my boss and the chief executive officer, saying that I had no right to examine these particular files, and that was a really large red flag for me, and my team for that matter, because we put a lot of effort in benchmarking studies back to COSO, COBIT, because there are IT issues in there as well, in regards to the database and what the data within the database actually said. What was the story that the data was trying to tell us? And it was a very interesting moment, finding out that that particular series of managers had done that. And I knew that at that particular point I had two paths to go down. I can continue on my current path and choose to say very little or nothing in regards to the malfeasance, what I perceived to be malfeasance at that time, or to take it to the federal government. And it was at that juncture I chose to take it to the federal government.
You take it to the federal government, and who was the first office you contact?
The first group that I contacted was the office of the Congressman of Silvestre Reyes in El Paso, Texas.
Okay.
That is where the largest contract was with the federal government for people with disabilities. And after a little bit of research and actually having some of my colleagues do some research and find out who the proper point of contact was based upon relationship and knowledge of the office, I reached out to the office and let them know what my concerns were at that particular time. At that point, it was referred to several different federal agencies, and it became apparent once they started doing preliminary investigations, whether it was the Defense Contract Audit Agency, the Army Audit Agency, AAA, Army Criminal Investigative Division, and Naval Criminal Investigative Services, or NCIS, that it was much bigger than me. And it was something that I needed better expertise trying to find results and conclusions that I couldn't understand, and I didn't understand at that time. That's where, at that particular point, I got a lawyer. And from there, that's where I cooperated with the federal government by wearing a recording device throughout that one audit that I was talking about at Fort Bliss, Texas. Actually doing the investigation of the people with disabilities and whether they were truly disabled or not.
And how long did you wear a wire?
It was all day that April day in 2009.
I mean, were you nervous? Was it, did you feel pressure?
I was tremendously fearful. I mean, no organization, no university, no training no training course can ever prepare you for something like that. It's something you just have to experience and work through. I mean, at that particular juncture, I was tremendously fearful of being found out, of having the whole case unravel, because everyone, whether it was my lawyer, my co-plaintiff, the federal government, the investigators, everyone was relying upon me to do the best job that I could. Based upon the facts, my employer was doing wrong by not only the people with disabilities, but by the federal government, by the taxpayer. So it was, in a way, an easy decision, but sometimes the easiest decisions are the hardest ones.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to ask you, what kept you going?
I kind of talk a little bit about this going back to an article that I was fortunate to write for Fraud Mag. Actually, it's more of a little bit of a blurb underneath Mr. Woodford's longer article, and it talks about kind of the 8 F's on kind of the experience that I went through and what might be helpful to other whistleblowers. And just to run them down real quick, it comes down to being forbidden, the function, the form, having your family, having your friends, preparing for flack, having internal fortitude, and overcoming your fear with wherever that comes from. And how can I describe it? It's not easy. And I truly believe that the information that we gave to the federal government was based upon the data, was true and correct, and it could be reperformed for appropriate results and conclusions to be drawn. And those conclusions were drawn by the federal government and the Department of Justice.
So, what do you wish someone would have told you along the way? Was there anything that anyone could have told you to prepare you, or to any advice that someone could have given you?
I mean, by far and away, the biggest thing that I wish someone would have told me is how uncomforting the situation is. You are taking a tremendous leap of faith, not only from a professional perspective, but also personally as well, how it's impacted my family. Losing my job at that particular juncture, my wife also lost her job. We lost our house, had to sell one of our cars. We've had to move 3 times in almost 3 years. And all my group and I were trying to do was the right thing by the people with disabilities and by the organization. Again, getting back to your question, what would I want to know if I was a whistleblower going into the situation? And it really is, be prepared for a roller coaster ride of emotions, second guessing, and this not very clear area between what you know is right and what you have fears of. It's a total fight or flight type of response that you have. And that's the one thing, now that I'm thinking about it, that's really the one thing is, be prepared to really come to, decide which way are you going to go. Are you going to fight or flight?
You mentioned the effects that it can take, not just professionally, but personally. tell us a little bit about the toll that it took on. I mean, you said your career, your job ended, and then your wife shortly after lost her job. What were you going through, on a daily basis as a family when all of that hit?
A lot.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be glib, but I mean that's the simplest answer that I can give. I mean the detail really comes down to we were savers and we used all of our savings. We were believers and our beliefs were tested. We had the facts, but our facts were questioned. We had possessions, but some of those were taken away. I mean, ultimately, what it ultimately comes down to, at least in our judgment, is if you see something wrong being done, which way do you go? And I'm not one to make judgments upon anyone else because it's been extraordinarily hard on my family and I. Financial decisions most certainly affect how a person executes what their beliefs are with how it impacts your family life, how it impacts your finances, how it impacts your possessions. So, I mean, it's a very, very trying time in our family's history, and to a certain extent, we're very, very happy to have it behind us and being able to tell the story to people, investigators, fellow whistleblowers, what it really means to go through the story. And especially for the investigators, I don't think they understand it. It's easy to say that you do as an investigator perspective. But if someone is coming to you with good faith and giving you information, it's tremendously important that one either be non-judgmental or be concerned about that particular informant or whistleblower's perspective. There were unfortunately several times in my experience where from people in charge where we were actively questioned and almost borderline ridiculed for the positions that we took based upon the facts from what we saw at the organization. So it's very, and my wife experienced that along with me. My daughter, who's born only a month and a half before I wore a wire, unfortunately has had to experience that her whole entire life. She's known no different. It's only until very, very recently where things from a financial perspective and a stability perspective have gotten better for her, where she's actually realized and understood that. The biggest thing that you have to do if you're in that situation is you have to network. You have to find friends within your professional associations, personal friends, friends in high places, friends in low places, because you never know where your next friendship is going to come from. Trying to find, good people to hang out with, and more appropriately for, from a career perspective to your question, Mandy, how to go out and find that next gig, because the gig is out there. It's just a matter of finding it. And it is harder for a whistleblower. Let us be clear about that. But ultimately, you have to reconcile yourself to the fact that it will be harder for you. Okay, so how do you overcome that? You get in front of that person face to face, and over a period of time, you engender a relationship that's long-lasting. That's how you get a job.
Where we are now, the term whistleblower has, gone up and down and backwards and forwards. Why do you think the term has such great connotations, in the circle we're in, it definitely does. But why does it also seem to have such a negative connotation in some circles?
Because to be a whistleblower, you do have to damage trust in a way. You're damaging trust within the organization. And that from a corporate perspective, that's where you damage your trust and damage your brand. But for what purpose? And that's ultimately, where over the past, let's call it 10 or 15 years, starting with Sharon Watkins or Cynthia Cooper, going on through Harry Markopolos and several others that I've had the good fortune of meeting, it's for what purpose that matters. It's for the objective truth and trying to solve a problem. That's where it matters. Sometimes an organization isn't always aligned to that objective truth. It is for the truth that they perceive or their subjective truth. I'm tremendously fortunate to have found really good friends within the professional associations that have helped me out, and the blessings that they've given to me have been numerous, too numerous to count. And we hopefully have moved for our final time to stay with our current organization and to stay now in the state of Texas. So it is a good thing. It most certainly is a good thing. And the future hopefully is much more calm than it has been the past 3 or 4 years. And I don't think I would wish this on my worst enemy.
So I know people have probably asked you this, and we talked about this before when we've talked in previous conversations, but would you do it again? And, is there anything you'd do differently?
I think that last part is key. I would do it again, but differently. I'm not absolutely sure that I would have gone down the road that to declare myself a whistleblower, because it's too hard. It was too hard for my family. It was too hard for me, and too hard for our position in life. And what I mean by that is, it is nice to have to move because you choose to move.
Not
it sucks when you're forced to move again and again and again. So it's from that point of reference that I say I would do it, because one of the definitions I have is to make right of a social wrong. And this was clearly a social wrong, in my judgment, based upon the harm, the hurt to the people with disabilities, to the wounded warriors coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and to the taxpayer that was giving no-bid contracts. That's my judgment. But I would do it differently. And ultimately, throughout the situation, it has surprisingly made me more calm. I mean, my background is my grandma and grandpa immigrated from Switzerland, and my grandpa fought in the Second World War, and all he wanted to do was come home. And to the extent that we have come home, for example, we are moving in, and I think I told you a little bit about this, Mandy. We are moving in today to our brand new house. So it's a little bit of serendipity that we're having this conversation on the day that we're moving home.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and if your story can, hit somebody at the time, just like Amy's story hit you, then that's what we're going for. And
I mean, that is the point on why I'm doing this to begin with. This is two things. It's a reconciliation for me, and it's paying it forward, hopefully, to someone else.
Thanks for joining us for Fraud Talk. And we also want to especially thank Tim for his willingness to share his story and his lessons learned. We at the ACFE are proud to have him on our team, and we hope his story continues to impact those that may find themselves in similar situations. As always, we look forward to catching up with you next month when we dive headfirst into an embezzlement case study.